Alrighty, so up next, our panel session is Building Great Security Champions. Today we are joined by Rob Cuddy, Global Applications Specialist Evangelist. We have James, the Head of Cybersecurity Risk Methodology, Paul Bruce, Director of Customer Engineering, Vicky Hailey, AI and IT Ethics and Risk Consultant, Vishal Asthana, AVP Application Security, and Altaz Valani, Director of Insights Research. I will let you take it from here.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot, Raquel. Appreciate it. And thank you to our panelists for joining us today. Thank you, everybody, for attending this session. Today, really talking about security champions in an era where we know that there's a shortage of people inside security, and yet we've got to scale out this idea of security across multiple teams within the organization. So please feel free to keep the conversation very fluid. Ask your questions within Q&A. We'll take these questions as they come in as well. And let's get started. So Rob, you want to kind of kick us off on this?
Yeah, and hey, thanks for having us. Excited to see all of you guys. So we know, right, there's a lot of things that are going on in the space. So I think let's kind of level set for everyone. And as we want to set the context around security champions and the fact that we think that this is a really good thing to address the challenges. So I just want to ask you guys, what do you think some of the biggest challenges we're facing right now are, and where security champions might fit into that?
Well, I'll go first. So like they said, my name is Paul. I have been heavily involved in performance and reliability for a long time now. And as part of the local Boston DevOps community, just seeing what affinities and what deficiencies in certain people's mindsets, especially folks who come into the industry without some huge amount of education about all the various aspects of software and delivering systems into production that are as fault-free as possible, that are secure by default, privacy is respected. Those kind of things don't naturally come. Like there's always sort of a bleed around what happens as organizations shift their workforces and shift the people who are in them. So like just to level set, naturally, we're constantly leaking the expertise out of organizations. And so I think having not a security champ, but the notion of championing certain aspects, such as security, such as arguably what some of the people that have been deep into performance haven't really been doing for the past 15 or 20 years, right? In various different spots. Same thing with InfoSec, right? There's the back office of the things you got to do to make sure that you're doing your job great. And then there's the front office. It's kind of like a restaurant. If you don't have the front, people don't get served.
Right.
And so from a championing perspective, I think that's speaking more towards the front half of the conversation, which is to say, how do we encourage these things into our organizations? What does that mean? And based on how people are working, and that changes, right? A lot of things are in pipelines now. What does security by default mean? How do you apply these policies, practices, and frameworks in the security space directly into pipelines, directly into code patterns and practices?
I think that's absolutely great, Paul. And why I'm saying that is because as an IT auditor in DevSecOps, what I'm always seeing is throwing the responsibility over the wall to the technical guys, as opposed to having this across the organization. So I would be an advocate for everybody has to be a security champion. The more eyes you have looking at what you're trying to protect against, the better. And that then just goes to support the actual technical gurus who have to do the work. But they can't do everything. And so the champions, I think, have to be right through the organization.
Right.
Yeah, and I can extend on that. This whole shift that we're seeing in the industry around self-service models and how do engineering teams be empowered to sort of take care of stuff, most of the stuff on their own when it comes to, let's say, security, that is nearly impossible unless you have implants or security implants in engineering organizations, whether you call them security champions or evangelists or advocates or whatnot, that does not matter. And then work through them to have these collaborative bridges, because that's, I think, another key problem or maybe an opportunity space where the mindset of moving from governance-led cultures to engineering-led cultures is a huge shift, right? Because security teams cannot scale. Like no matter how hard they try, I think the
Right.
scaling is, you will always have this silly ratios. I think at the keynote I heard that, right? So the ratios could be 1:35, 1:50, in some cases 1:200. So then how does your support model for security scale in such environments? So I think that's where effective security champions fits in, or fit right
Right.
in.
Right. And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I was thinking about how, most of us grew up kind of in the agile space. And for at least a while there was this mentality that folks were kind of plug and play. So if you were, behind on a project, right, you just throw more bodies at it and somehow that solves everything. And we all know, obviously, that doesn't work. So we have that skill problem, right, in here, and thinking through how do we get security all the way through the organization. And I've heard everything from security is everybody's job to, it's no one central thing, and that kind of thing. So I think this is a big area about how do we actually scale skill and let it work across what we're doing. So I think we've heard the term quite a bit in different ways, right? I've heard everything from security ninjas to security champions to roles and responsibilities. As we're talking about this, and maybe for folks that are trying to think of this, what do you guys think of when you hear that term security champion? What does that actually mean to you and to the organizations that you're working with?
I can go first.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. Okay. In our realm, and when I say our, it's in US Bank's realm, security champions are really folks who would like to voluntarily learn about various security aspects and develop a proactive mindset of baking security into their product lines. So that's what the program means for us. That's how I've been building it. It has a huge element of collaboration, right? So every step of the program involves that. So from a definition perspective, when somebody new asks that if I sign up for this program, will I have to sign in blood? It's like, no. That's when you explain and say, hey, you know what? This is really for you. Even though it's facilitated by security, the program itself is for you, right? So we can arm you, empower you, coach you, but you'll eventually determine what you want to make out of the program. So that's really the kind of definition that we've been using and running with at the bank.
Nice.
So I'll give two angles here. The first one is anytime I hear a champion, I think of somebody who's a superhero, which for me doesn't have positive connotations. It's a single point of failure. And I hate that I'm bringing it up, but there are some books in the DevOps space that are sort of already culturally accepted as if they're fact. Some of the stuff like the Phoenix Project. And I just remember the character, John, the security guy, right?
Yeah.
Which,
John and
he probably did his best to try to champion him, but ultimately most of the answers were no, late, right? And problematic to actually integrate. It didn't encourage people to take some of the responsibility for that. And I think it's really important to parse out the difference between the crap we got to do, the tactical stuff, right? The actual things that check our audit checklists, the approach we take, and the goal we try to serve. And I think that various different organizations, divisions of organizations, I'm not a big fan of that notion of breaking silos because it sounds like you're breaking stuff.
Right.
But I know the small benefit and a lot of the drawbacks about what most people mean by silos. And ultimately, if let's say your security championing activities are mostly focused, let's say, on metrics about how well you're doing as an organization, like I come from the QA space. So anytime somebody says, I ask them how they measure their stuff and they say, oh, well, this is how many defects we found. Like, what does that do for anybody other than the defects? It's like, wait a second, isn't your better metric based on the goal, which you should share with other people, which is how often is the feedback actually taken action on by the teams that have to do their job, but also get this feedback from you. And it's important enough where they're like, oh man, we got to do something about that. In the performance space, it's all about Sev 1 incidents in production. No, it's not.
No.
Right. That's the after effect
It's
of
a
a lack
consequence.
of mindset in a team. And so bringing all this back, my point is, to me, champion, right, is like saying developer or tester. Let's lop the off the end for a second. And what you get is develop, test, secure. These are things that we have to do. We have to do them together. And that's the real championing, is figuring out how can you distill the subject matter expertise into things that can run relatively reliably, predictably in an automated context to prevent the obvious toil from happening, which then frees your actual subject matter expertise up to further improve that approach, maybe be more consultative. You have a little more time because you're not running around doing the tactical crap. That stuff's getting done by various team members or various automation practices. So I think when it comes to me, it's not about a champion, it's about championing, and it's about almost like bringing the pain forward for the teams that are doing the work to produce a product. Well, if we talk about building quality and or building security in, the best way to do that is to make it their pain and some of that responsibility, like what was mentioned earlier about self-service. It's not just about giving them the keys to the kingdom. You think about the self-service buffet bar at a restaurant. They usually have to put sneeze guards in front.
You would
not
hope.
for people who just want to walk up and sneeze on things, but if accidents happen. So if you think about the self-service as like it's not always a good thing. So there has to be really good guardrails. That's what the security championing should really be focused on, is how do we provide guardrails that take care of the obvious work, shift that over to the product teams. They might not even know these things are happening, but they benefit from that. And then ultimately bringing it back to saying, okay, what do we do with our time? What is a more effective way to drive down toil and cost and improve the mindset in the organization? Sorry, that was long-winded.
I think Vicky, you wanted to get a point in here as well on the panel. So Vicky, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thanks. I think, Paul, that's all great in a perfect world, but you're dealing with humans, and humans face resistance and inertia. So what I see as security champions and championing is somebody who understands that inertia, becomes a change agent. And that has to start at the top, number one.
Yeah.
If you don't get that as an example, leading by example, nobody's going to do anything, because everybody's going to realize, well, if the leaders aren't doing it, why should we?
Right.
So it's that responsibility to accept it, to own it, and say, look, we know this is hard because security is an overhead, but we don't want it to be an overhead. We want it to be an opportunity. And so that's, I think, where the security champions come in. They translate, they interpret, and they integrate against that inertia, and they bring us forward in that change. And without those champions, which again, in this context is leadership. That's a synonym for what we're talking about, these champions in that context, because without that, nothing is going to move.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, exactly. I love the direction this is taking too, because, and we could do an entirely different discussion on this, but I'm a big believer, and I think, Paul, you would be as well, right? That security is a quality metric and an important part of it. And so, you mentioned coming from the testing space and how to me, this idea of championing throughout is a great way to kind of bring those two things together. Right, get that security quality. Everybody talks about doing it at speed, but it comes down to what Vicky just said, right? It's a people problem, and getting them to actually be able to get over the hump there. So love that thought. That's
And
I think it's good, Vishal.
So another thing, just to add to what Vicky said, I think the whole fabric of champions is dependent on the organizational dance. Like every organization has its own culture and a dance. And one way of standing up such a program might work well in one setup, but it may fail completely on the other setup, right? So that's where that change agent and principles of change leadership and change management, not just change management, but change leadership, they have to be incorporated, as in how do we pave the path for the champions or the championing to happen, where people want to help and do and own those aspects of championing, right? So I think that's a very good call out from Vicky.
Yeah, I kind of picked up a couple of things that we need to make sure we're aligned. And leadership. And Jack, I'd like to kind of pull on you a little bit here. You come from the risk side of things, so you're thinking about this whole thing from a business perspective. We've got folks doing DevOps, we've got security champions doing things. There's investment being poured into this stuff. What's your experience? What are you seeing? How do we translate this into ways and means that make sense to the business? Can you talk and share a little bit about your experience?
Yeah, when I think about a security champion, you have to sort of decide who you're a champion for. And I think far too often we in security want people to be champions for us. We don't exist for our own purposes. We exist to enable the organizational goals and objectives and missions of the company that we're working at. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind there too, is we want people in the business to care about security. Business wants security to care about the business. So I think trying to find a way to bridge those two things is really the key role for people that are trying to be security champions. And that means sometimes we're going to delay business operations in order to make things secure. And conversely, it means that sometimes we're going to delay security things in order to meet a business objective. And that is the key part of a risk management decision-making process, is laying plain all the things that could happen if things go wrong and making a decision regardless of that. It takes no skill whatsoever to shut everything down and say, we're going to make this the most secure thing ever, and then delay. It really takes skill and risk and a certain amount of understanding of what the marketplace will bear to be able to say, these out of these 10 security things, these 6 are going to be critical for us. And these other 4 that you've explained very well and described for us what the impact could be if things go wrong, we're going to delay those to the next release because we have other important goals to do. So we can all be security champions by understanding that sometimes the right answer is not the most secure answer. But we can be specific security champions by helping others in the organization, one, understand a complete list of all the bad things that can happen so they can make the best decision from it. And 2, helping others become comfortable with that level of uncertainty.
Appreciate the spirit of what you're saying, which is not, we never take any risks. I mean, in practicality, everybody constantly takes risks everything they do. And it's a matter of which ones do you even know about. But it's also, if you know enough about it, like risk management is involved. And I think Vicky and I have been, and Altaz have been working on this IEEE 2675 standard, where one of the sections is specifically around risk management. And some of the thinking that came out of that was, it's not about, can't we take risks, right? It's about, let's lay bare what the risks are, be clear about that, have a comprehension of that, maybe layer them into some of these checklists that people oftentimes have in their sort of agilista, let's just get it done, and then just ask the question, is this a risk we as a local group, a team, are willing to take, which ends up being the product owner who was responsible for allowing that decision, or the product management on top of that. But the second layer is asking, is this in line with our organizational risk policy around what we are willing to take and what we aren't willing to take from a risk perspective? There are one or two questions as well. Once we get to the question of, where do we find these champions, right? There's also a follow-up to that, which is, how do we retain champions? So before we get to that question, I have one thing, because I know, Vicky, we've had this kind of conversation in the past, and Paul just barely touched on it. When we talk about aligning risk with the Security Champions program, there are different levels within an organization. Can you talk a little bit from your experience about creating these different levels and how ultimately each of these tie together to the organizational risk and mandate of both enabling and still at the same time managing the risk from a security perspective?
Sure, and that goes into the whole championing perspective, because if you think about spreading risk across the organization, everybody's going to look at it from their own perspective. The developers are going to see one thing, the security folks are going to see something else, the leadership team that's responsible for the entire organization and customer relationships, they're going to see other things. And so the whole risk perspective has to integrate all of those perspectives so that the right decisions can be made. And as Paul was saying, it's not that you're not taking risks. You are taking risks, but you're taking managed and informed risks so that you have that capability to understand what the consequences are. And that gives you the ability to talk to the stakeholders so that they're understanding what the risks are, and then they can make the informed decisions or push back and say, no, that's too much for me. And that just gets that whole harmonization of everybody trying to get the same objectives done. And so when it's spread and it's understood that everybody has to look at their own perspective, because you can't expect the CEO to understand what the developers are looking at and vice versa. But they have to have that common understanding where they can communicate and the decisions can be made. So that's where the championing really takes role. It's not just a word, it's the actual heart of getting the work done and who understands it and who has the best decisions for the organization at heart. And that takes teamwork.
And I think it's also important to think about, we have these classic risk response kind of things, mitigate, transfer, those kind of things. And the amount of ability for people at different levels of the organizations to make those decisions varies wildly. For most development teams, the only real option available to you is to mitigate, or you don't get to accept those risks. Your only option is to mitigate. So the lens from which those people might view these things is very narrow. At a higher level in the organization, we might transfer by buying a cyber insurance policy, but that covers a whole a very large amount of scenarios, right? That's not, you don't transfer for a particular bug in production. It's the whole thing is covered that way, and so on down. So that's why the involvement and the perspective of people at various levels of the organization is critical, to try and make sure that we're, one, advocating for a more secure environment where it makes sense, and two, understanding that these decisions are going to be made at different levels, and sometimes the acceptance of something or the transference of it has already happened at a higher level.
Right. And I think there's this just kind of human nature problem, and I think Vicky was touching on it as well, that we tend to confuse championing with ownership. And in a lot of organizations, right, it's like, hey, you're the champion, but you end up becoming the de facto sort of owner, make everything happen, go. So I guess I'm wondering, how do we make it a little bit easier for folks to kind of adopt and get involved in that without feeling like there's this huge burden now on my shoulder of I've got to do this all myself?
Well, that's an easy one. Make it part of their job. It's the visibility of security that people don't recognize, and so they don't understand. Oh, you mean I'm supposed to protect everything on my desk? Oh, okay, now that I know that, I can put it away. It's giving them a context and a scope and those guardrails that Paul was talking about in that particular job, and that focuses them. And then their manager has the bigger perspective of that group of employees and their little ecosystem and so on. And if you have enough of those viewpoints, then you're going to have the overlaps as well. So that's going to eradicate those silos that Paul was talking about. So it's really making people focus on what it is that they do and recognizing where the vulnerabilities are.
Yeah. I think we should go ahead.
I'd also throw in, I listen to and read a lot of different things, right? And I try not to conflate stuff, but sometimes I purposely do to figure out if there's meaningful overlap in terms of concepts. One of the things that I was rewatching recently was a guy named Dan North, who used to work at ThoughtWorks. He then went on to do his own things. One of the talks he gave in GoTo conference, I think 2016, was patterns of effective teams. And he had this whole toolbox of various different patterns. One of the things he specifically says is patterns are not for junior, newbies, right? The practices are just go and do this practice. But if you try to give a pattern of work to somebody who is new, who needs the practice, right? Then they're gonna find a way to get 36 different patterns, like the publisher, factory, subscriber, all the things into the one class of code that they're writing. It's going to be a mess, right? That's not the point. The point is not the number of patterns. The point is picking the right patterns. And at first, right, the question is, how do we encourage this? How do we get people to pay more attention to this? There's definitely sort of a make it part of their job, in the sense of there's got to be a checkbox somewhere, right? And everybody's going to game that off. But if it's not there, it doesn't ever happen. It's like if a tree falls in the woods kind of thing. So going back to the Dan North thing, one of the patterns he pulls out is something called Dreyfus squared, which I can't go into detail on, other than the fact that you want to pair people with sort of the right moment of empathy, right? A junior and a lead together, right? The lead had been a junior and knows the pain and suffering, and so it's very close from an empathy perspective on how to encourage that practice or these practices in the person that they're paired with. But you never really want to pair an architect, right? Who's all about patterns of patterns of patterns with somebody who just needs practices. And if you try to give them the pattern of pattern, it becomes a mess. So I definitely think internal education, right? In the performance space, we oftentimes have not just lunch bag sessions, but workshops. They do a lot of internal documentation to say, hey, if you're going to go launch a service, here's a good set of practices, but here's the pattern as well. So it fits multiple audiences. So really good internal documentation is super important, but not just like sending it off, having a feedback mechanism where if somebody gets stuck, it's very easy to connect to the security champions, right? To actually have that meaningful conversation, because that's the moment of learning, right? That's the moment where they haven't done this yet. And if they beach themselves, it's going to feel bad emotionally. And from a learning education perspective, it's not going to encourage further. So you really want to pick up on those moments. And I think that's actually a really important thing, is for the champions to, in part, be owners of these good practices documents, the people who are sort of on call to help teams effectively use the practices and the patterns that they put forth, which means that you have to put them forth in the first place.
So let's dive in for a moment to the Q&A here. It's been sitting in there for a while. Let's kind of move on this. How do we address retention? So Vishal, I'm gonna pose this to you. As cyber skills are acquired and matured, opportunities outside the org now pull these investments away. So we just spent money, right? And that money seems to be leaking, right? Or at least that's the perception. What are your thoughts? Like how do you respond to something like that?
Let the goodness spread, right? So it's better to have security aware skill leaking, whether it's from within a team or moving across teams or outside the organization, than let's say you have, for example, developers who are not security aware, and then they are going to different organizations and still having to deal with this. What's this whole security thing that I have to worry about? So I'm not able to remember. There was some quote or some humorous quote around this where I think this was around HR asking this, I think, similar kind of question, that why should we train our people? Because if we do, they'll leave. And it's like, well, that's good, because at least if you train them, they will leave with that education and they'll be able to apply it elsewhere. So that's right. At least for our program, that has not been a concern. In fact, the way we've been running our program is quite opposite to making this a part of a job for anybody who wishes to participate, because we again want to invite people over inflicting this as a job that thou shall have to do. So we did this brave experiment to see if we can steer clear from that approach, saying that, okay, now the security team thinks that we need champions, and you guys are, guess what, you've been voluntold into this program, blah, blah, blah. So we just flipped that script and said, no, let people volunteer, let them choose if they want to join, and they can stay as long as they want. We'll help them, coach them, but clear the path for them to sort of come forward. And people have come forward, by the way, right? And then at the same time, to this question that has been asked, there are people who would voluntarily even exit, right? So they would join, they'd say, yay, I'll take care of this, I'll take care of that. And then, where are you? Like, hello, what happened, right? And on the other hand, there are folks who we have graduated to the rock star stage. They are literally rock stars. Like, that's the exact term that they have here at the bank, because these folks continue to go above and beyond in so many aspects, which I personally could not have even imagined that they would be willing to do that, right? Is that an interesting experiment? Yes. Has it borne fruit so far? Yes. I don't know what the future holds, but from engineering, what I keep hearing is that they like the non-stick approach, which security teams are notorious for. You will do it because I told you, otherwise bad things will happen. Otherwise, I won't let you go to production. Why? Because I said so, and I'm security, right?
Yeah.
So just an example.
Yeah. So any other thoughts? Here we are making an investment, and we get into discussions like ROSI, right? The return on security investment. You're asking for a security program. If we train them, then what's going to be the return on this investment? Is that the right way to take a look at it? Any other thoughts, opinions from the panel at this point?
I think there's never a return on security investment. I know we like this idea of we thinking there's some sort of investment that we're making, but traditional finance people will tell you there's no such thing as a return on investment. Now, the next best thing is cost avoidance, and it's basically the same thing. But I think that little turn of phrase makes a big difference when we think about this. Nobody's going to write us a check for doing these good things later. It's sort of like buying an insurance policy and not making a claim later. Like you didn't actually get anything back, but you are avoiding really bad outcomes that could happen later. Right. This is a minor thing, and within the security community, using it makes sense and it resonates to us. But sometimes for business people, you have to be careful because that term does not have the same connotation to them as it does to us. So that's why I think it's important to think about, hey, if we build up our security culture, if we make sure that people in the customer service to make sure that these things that happen, we can avoid these bad things that happen later. I think that's an important way to think about it.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And I can add something there, just on the specific ROSI perspective. One of the things that we've been doing, which has been resonating well, is keeping a meticulous track of tangible outcomes from each champion participant, right? And good. Tying them back to high-level impact areas for our business lines and across the bank. So why should the bank care if a champion did something, right? So one of the points mentioned was around cost avoidance, right? So we have certain impact categories around employee engagement, employee cost avoidance because you don't need an extra headcount, yada yada, or maybe process improvements, etc. So we have come up with categories which would make sense to the bank business lines, and then we tie these outcomes to those categories. So if anybody asks, what's the return on investment? How is this program making an impact? Here is how, and all those narratives are now data backed, right? That's so none important. Of those outcomes, yeah. So it's not like, I think this is an outcome because look at this person, look at this champion who put 5 hours of his or her time, and what was the net result, right? So if that question is gray, like if it doesn't have a net result, it doesn't go anywhere. But the moment you say this team or this champion or group of champions helped us with the pilot of an upcoming security capability because of which we were able to address blah, then that's a very strong narrative. So we have
a lot of operational risk teams will maintain databases of near misses, and this sounds like a lot of that same kind of thing. Because we did this, we had the opportunity to avoid this bad thing that could have happened.
Yeah, Paul, it looked like you were going to jump in there.
Yeah, I just this sounds a lot too like it's not so much about the ROI, right? It's about predictable and reliable work that can be done in an organization. And when you're the velocity from like agile world, like however you want to measure it, well, like I remember this. This is error budgets from a book called Site Reliability Engineering. So from my performance and reliability work, one of the concepts, one of the notions is this idea that the error budget is about an agreement up front before you're already in Sev 0, Sev 1 type situations, where if you have a number of errors or a number of problems in production, right, a certain percentage of that, your availability, your uptime, whatever, and it's tied to those metrics, that you actually, if you skip that, if you slip that, you actually have to come back to the table and say, we are going to, instead of pushing new work, we are going to do improvement work. We're going to get that level back up there, right? So I don't mean to say, it would be interesting if people have ideas about how to apply the notion of error budgets into the value that it provides in terms of predictability on the security front. But I just wanted to bring in that notion to say, this is a self-balancing system, right? Or it's not like it just appears and magically everything self-balances. You have to agree up front. You have to be willing to have leaders that say, yeah, this is a pattern that we see working in some other thing. How would we apply it here? And then let's go and try that a little bit, right? Let's start to build that notion and see what works. And so I think rather than trying to say, I totally agree that ROI in security or performance is a myth, right? What's not a myth is your predictability. And the bigger problem that also is shared between performance and security is crap that you didn't expect, right?
Yeah.
0-day issues or unexpected exploits on the security side. You know what? That marketing push that made 1 million people go to your website on the performance side is an unpredictable, unexpected thing. We know those things are going to happen, but there is a ton more stuff that we do that we knowingly do and that we push through our pipelines and out the door that don't benefit from this notion of balance. So I wonder if there's a value to thinking about the predictability of your delivery outward, at least for that ton of work that is planned work, to have a balance. And maybe there's a notion of error budgets that apply to security incidents as well.
Yeah. There's a lot to that. And it, you mentioned the Phoenix project before, right? And there's that whole notion of the unplanned marketing campaign that caused all kinds of issues in there. Listening to that though, I think there's a place today too where, and I'll admit, right, when I hear things like KPI and ROI, I want to follow it with EIEIO, but this notion of connecting technical debt to this championing and lowering business risk and raising trust and confidence, right? There's this whole intersection. And, I have 2 adult children, right? 21 and 18, but watching them grow up, every app that they would encounter, there was this, for some reason, right, an assumed layer of trust that of course they're going to do the right thing because the app works the way it's supposed to. And we all know behind the scenes that's not true. But I feel like this is a place where security champions or folks who are championing, right, can make a huge difference in helping the business raise overall quality and then turn that into trust in the marketplace, saying, hey, we're safe to work with, right? And that in and of itself has huge value.
You've just broached into ethics.
Well, silly me.
Vicky, more. What do you mean?
Go ahead.
Well, this is exactly what you're talking about, that, you assume that it's right and you assume that they're not abusing and they're not going to be exploiting the user, but that's a huge assumption in a profit marketplace.
Right.
And that's why we're seeing, especially in the AI technologies, that ethics is emerging as critical, because there has to be underneath, what is that trust and how do you break that down, and what is the expectation of the user in terms of the not just the functionality, but what's going to happen with their behavior, their interactions, the data that they're leaving behind, all those breadcrumbs, and how can that be exploited. And so we get into the ethics and the morality of what this functionality needs to do. And so that whole suite of IEEE standards is trying to address that, because, for example, in nudging, if you're nudging, then, if you're not nudging for good purposes, then where are you nudging? And so putting a standard around something like that to make sure that the ethical nudging is apparent to the developers and the user is part of that foundation of building that trust. And unless those are now becoming more explicit, because the AI technologies are making the decisions for us, we have a lot more at stake. So those risks factors have now escalated, in my opinion. So we're in a new, I think, a new era of understanding that security and ethics have to be hand in hand.
Yeah,
it's interesting. I'm also seeing in the circles that I'm in as well, Vicky, like the security and privacy realms are in fact rolling up now into ethics, and based on that framework, you now determine what are going to be your privacy standards or the particular elements that you're going to put into your products, or even from a cultural perspective, for example, and similarly from a security standpoint as well. And I think this is a good transition now for us to start to think about, within the context of a security program, there will be challenges. Some of the challenges we've talked about, there are things with resourcing, there are things about trying to prove the value of a Security Champions program. There are things related to AI and automation, which is all over in the DevOps space and continues to grow. But just kind of opening this up a little bit. What are some of the challenges we are seeing out there today? Not necessarily the challenges that we know are there, but also nudging this a little bit forward. And what do we expect to see coming up?
So the short is, dev and DevOps and that culture has their own language too, and you need to be willing to ask and put yourself out there and be like, I don't know what that means. Could you explain to me real quick what that means? Right? But in the meantime, you're also developing a conversation and a relationship and hopefully a dialogue to do the same for them for your stuff. But you also need to know, why is Kubernetes? What are the security CVEs on Kubernetes, which came out, I think, over a year ago? There's this whole host of them. And so finally, security people, InfoSec people have some legitimate thing to say, Kubernetes isn't safe by default. No, it means, what are you going to do about that? How are you going to ensure that that's part of your strategy when you're rolling Kubernetes out in your organization? So actively lean forward, get in there, and make sure that the language barriers are getting in your way.
Sounds like
Vishal, sorry, Vicky, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it sounds like interoperability to me. From a human perspective. Sorry,
Vicky, you drop these sort of one word things, and it's like it's a bomb.
But it's a nice bomb.
Go ahead, unpack that for us, please.
Oh, well, we look at interoperability, we talk about it from a perspective of products, but what Paul is talking about is exactly the same thing, from departments and units in an organization. They all have their own language, and there has to be some point when you look at interoperability, what you're trying to do is get it to a language so everybody understands it, and that's exactly what Paul just described. So it's not just a technical level of this. This has to be to transcend to all of those areas that are going to interface, because if you don't have that interoperability at the interface level, then the information stops, can't go anywhere.
Right.
Vishal, your thoughts? Sorry, you're on mute. I don't know if we can't hear you.
Yeah, I double muted myself. Sorry about that.
Good.
I was smiling. I felt like laughing out loud when Paul shared the acronym part, because we've had a funny thing just for the program itself. At the bank, we call it the AppSec Champions program. The acronym is ASC. You'll be surprised how many people miss that part. And I've been asked, what's that ACS thing? It's the ASC thing. And it's like, it's not that thing. It's an actual program, and it's actually called AppSec Champions, right? So I think I totally agree to that. The other part which I see, which was brought up as a question as well, is the retention portion. Yes, that can become a challenge in situations or in teams where they only have, let's say, one person who chose to join the program. So one of the ways where we try to address that is encourage teams to have backups. Think of having a secondary champion, like more than one person from the same team. So if the first one wins the lottery or gets hit by a vehicle of his or her choice, the program doesn't stop for that team, right? So that's one. The other thing that I haven't tried yet, this is really like work in progress, almost hot off the press, is using those tangible outcomes and the metrics to now go to business lines and now ask them to fund the program from an incentivization perspective. Instead of saying, I need people to join the program and make it part of their job, it's like you have people who have volunteered. They have done this for you. They're part of your business line. So your business line is benefiting from a security mindset and a culture. Would you like to fund a formal incentivization program? So the idea is that if they bite, or whichever business lines bite, the chances are that for those business lines, when they're actual team members, the roles don't matter in our program. You could be a dev, you could be a Scrum Master, you could be on QA side of things, you could be a tech architect, doesn't matter. So we've kind of leveled that field. We have said, you don't need any of those prerequisites. You have an interest in improving the security posture for your team, come join the program. We'll work with you, tailor it for your needs, right? So if coming back to the funding, if that goes through, then I I think that whichever business lines choose to do that will end up improving the retention as an indirect effect. If not a direct effect, it's probably going to be an indirect effect. So those are things that I see. The third thing which I see as an ongoing challenge is this tussle which engineering teams have when they are managing business requirements and security requirements. There is still that security is this add-on thing that I have to do, as opposed to it needs to be baked in because it's common sense, right? But then common sense may not be all that common for whatever reasons, right? So that's a tussle which I find that the champions who are on our program have this priority battle in their mind where they're trying to figure out what should I spend time on. Well, but I need to go to prod, so I need to focus on this. And then this is where I also see organizations tend to have, well, not all, but there is this risk exception culture. Like we talked about that whole risk mitigation, transfer, etc. The risk exception culture, I think, needs to really go away. That concept itself is flawed because teams intentionally or unintentionally find a way to defer things if it's affecting their business process, right?
Right.
And then it becomes that he said this, I said this kind of discussion, which usually doesn't help anybody. So, yeah.
Right.
It's a really interesting point that you made there, because on the one hand, you want to get security requirements in place really early on and designed into the whole product. But on the other hand, security is reactive. We never know where the next kinds of vulnerabilities are coming from because they're always one step ahead and we're always in react mode. Even if we have layers and we've done the breadth of it and so on, they're always one step ahead. That's the whole nature of security. So trying to get it, it's a chicken and egg. You're trying to get the requirements in there and understood and met, and yet they're changing without you even knowing it.
Yep. And Vicky, I've literally used that phrase chicken and egg 3 times already this week, describing just that. I mean, to me, there's always like that proactive, reactive going on. And I know Altaz and I, and most of you are sure big fans of getting security in at the design point, right? And thinking about it from the beginning, and being able to build it in versus bake it in versus bolt it on kind of thing at the end. So, I mean, to me, that's an ideal place where you can find some of these folks, right? If you're doing those design capabilities and you're trying to do, threat modeling at the beginning of a project, and you're validating and updating your model as you go through and those kinds of things, those folks who start to engage, those ones, and sometimes too, it's even the people that are complaining the loudest, like going, oh man, I got to fix this again. I got to deal with this again, right? Those, I think, are the folks that are perfect for this kind of thing, to champion stuff, right? They're passionate, they're excited, they're interested in getting in there. I guess what I wonder about, though, is, and it kind of goes to the retention question that we had a little bit earlier, just incentivizing these folks, right? And getting it so, like, how do we raise the value within the organization? Because we've talked so much about having this being good for the organization, but what about the person doing it, right? What are some of the things that you guys think can make it more worthwhile, or for people to go, hey, yeah, that's something I want to be a part of and do, to get us kind of getting a program in place that works really well?
So I can take a stab at that. Am I muted? No, I'm not. Okay.
No, you're good.
So there are two things which seem to work reasonably well so far. One of them, and this is based on feedback, this is not me saying this is feedback from the actual champions on the program. Those who are consistently engaged are the ones who find any knowledge that they gain from this program, if they are able to go back and apply in some shape or form, it's a no-brainer for them to spend time. It could be anything, right? So maybe it's a better way to run your scans. Maybe it's, I didn't know how threat modeling is done. Maybe I want to learn about that. Blah, 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 right? So if they are able to connect those dots themselves, then I find that they don't need to be motivated, right? So they end up participating on an incremental basis. They're kind of going back, and really one of the champions summed it up very well recently. I was having a word with him about one of these discussions, and he says, the biggest value prop for me has been figuring out how to make security BAU, like business as usual, for my product. And this program has helped me in 1, 2, 3, 4. He listed like 3 or 4 different things. I was collecting some testimonials from people recently. So I think that's one. The second one, which came as a surprise to me, is skill building, which means, like, for example, on our champions program, there's an option for people to get a formal certification, not just a fancy looking badge. It's an actual formal certification that they can add to their CV versus saying, oh, I was a rock star at US Bank, or I was a rock star champion at US Bank. Okay. But if you say I'm a certified software professional, whatever, like CSSLP or equivalent, something like that, I find that people are going for that as well, because they feel that this adds value to their personal skills as well. And the third thing that I have seen is cross coaching. Like, we've got champions who are on the program who have been there for a while, who've experienced now. And I've experimented with this question, whether you want to cross coach somebody who's new to the program within your team or some other team. And many of them have stepped up. And then I've gone back to them and I've said, like, anecdotal data. How does this feel? Like, are you sure you want to do this? Like, remember, the spirit is voluntary, etc. And those who have done it have said, yeah, absolutely. This makes a lot of sense, because now I feel I can confidently talk about and the practical aspects of security with other people who may be new to the concept or relatively new, etc., etc. So these 2 or 3 things seem to be working well so far.
Yeah.
Can I add to that just quickly? And that's
Yeah,
just
go ahead,
something
Vicky.
that Paul said earlier, and that's empathy. And it
Yeah.
reminds me of this commercial that they had where this insurance company had something fall on somebody's head as soon as they become an employee, so they would understand what the insurers were going through. And I think that's, if you understand the pain of the user or the organization itself, the consequences, I think that's a good motivator. But I like what Paul was saying in terms of the empathy aspect of it. If you build that in, then that's a tie that is really hard to unhook.
Yeah. So I've been fortunate to work with underneath a founder and a CEO for the past 4 years, that at no time did I question the spirit of our engagement together, that he actually cared about my career, which a good coach does, and not bosses. I mean, sometimes it happens a little bit. You get a coach and a boss and vice versa, but don't put that on bosses. Don't put that on management and managers to also be good coaches. There should be good coaching, right? It doesn't necessarily come from your direct boss, right? So the reason I mentioned that is going all the way back to John's question. Hey, John, if you're still on, thanks for hanging out. It says you're a director, so you understand the awesome and awful responsibility of figuring out how both attrition and retention and those aspects of your workforce are challenging, and you have to address this as a program, not as little fires that you constantly have to put out. Your specific question was, how do we address retention as cyber skills are acquired and matured? Opportunities outside the organization pull cyber investments away. Yeah, I mean, but that applies to everything. That applies to those dev folks over there. That applies to the performance. That applies to product management, right? That if you think about it as something to fight against, you got to flip that around. You got to make it so that your organization literally like breeds awesome people, and as they leave for other parts of their, you celebrate that, but at the same time, you're able to take that, and for people who are not completely new to the organization or to the space, but are coming into your organization going, well, I have some of these skills, and to Vishal's thing, they look at this and they go, is there a path for me to improve those skills? Right. Does the organization even make time for me to get better, or do they expect me to do that on nights and weekends, whether I want to or not, whether I already do or not? So providing a space that looks and actually is good for career development is important. And also those people who are attritioning, provided that it's not for bad reasons, like you've got maybe a pathological organization like Western might suggest, right? Even if it's bureaucratic, that's still okay, right? We can't all be perfectly generative. So the idea though is people, if they're building their skills up and they are moving on to other things, that's a good sign. It doesn't always feel good as a manager to have to fill that position again. But guess what? That's your other work, is to constantly be looking to fill the next junior to bring them up on time. So this is management 101. But anyway, the point is, like, it's not just a challenge, it's an opportunity, and the type of metrics that you use to attract people as well.
Exactly. No, and I think that's brilliant, because then it's not, you're moving away from tribal knowledge and all the kind of the silos that we talked about before, to an organization where skill can be scaled across, right? And it reminds me so much. I think, when we were talking before, right, I grew up kind of in that DevOps software automation place. And so we would talk to people all the time about, hey, today you're only doing this, but we want you doing this, and scaling your skills. So it's not about holding on to the knowledge I have and that being job security. That's actually today more insecurity. So just getting that out there. I love what you're talking about there. And we
say, like, in the Boston space, it's very hard to hire really highly qualified InfoSec and DevSecOps people, which is what we're trying to address with DevSecOps Days Boston next month. So yes, that is a challenge, but it's a challenge that we have to work as a community. And that's the difference, is if you're only working at it as a manager of a department or a set of champions, right? You've got a broader organization. There are other people who have these problems as well. Talk with them, but also think that there are other communities around you that are addressing this issue. And even if you're not in the Boston area, you're welcome to join us, and we're going to be addressing those issues. So.
Right. Well, they're still adjusting to Tom Brady being in Tampa, so
Anyways, we've come up to the end of our time. We could seriously go for another hour on this. Thank you very much, panelists, for joining us today. Thank you, to the audience for participating, coming, listening to what we have to say. Sorry, we couldn't solve the final question ultimately about the chicken or the egg. We're just going to have to wait on that one. But thank you very much. Have yourselves a wonderful day. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks, everybody.
Yep. Thanks.
Bye.
Boom. Man, that was fun. We should do that again.